Hello, everyone. Good morning, good
Bonjour à tous.
good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the sixth dialogues on Indigenous Peoples territories. It's an honor to have all of you as part of this initiative. We are very happy to have many people connecting from different parts of the world, and we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are connecting from. I'm Luisa Castaneda-Quintana, and the coordinator of the dialogues and the host of today's session that is about Indigenous peoples in Africa, challenges and complexities. Our guest today is Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim and Vital Bambanze. They are members of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you, Vital, and thank you, Hindou. We are very honored to have you all here. We are going to have around 50 minutes of dialogues with our special guests, and after that, we're going to open the floor for questions from the participants. With this in mind, we will now open the event with some welcoming remarks from a co-sponsor of the dialogues. And for this, we have a esteemed speaker, Clara Shang. She is member of the Indigenous Law Association of the University of McGill. Clara, the floor is yours. Before starting, I would like to tell you that there is interpretation in English and French. We are posting in the chat the information on how to use it. And thank you so much, Clara.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luisa. I really appreciate it. So as Luisa said, I'm Clara. I'm a law student at our faculty here in McGill, and I'm also a settler on Turtle Island. So as Luisa said, I'm a member of the Indigenous Law Association here, and ILADA, so that association, is a co-organizer of these dialogues. So again, special thank you to Luisa for leading the coordination of this event and for being such a great host, and to the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism as well for their support. So for those unfamiliar with the event series, this is the sixth one, which is amazing. The Dialogues on Indigenous Peoples Territory Stories of Resilience is an initiative to start conversations on Indigenous peoples, their realities, endeavors, and positive contributions on issues of global concern. The objective is to involve students, scholars, the faculty, civil society, and the larger public in meaningful discussions to foster theoretical and practical engagement to advance Indigenous peoples' rights. So in today's dialogue, the guests will delve into the challenges and complexities faced by Indigenous peoples in Africa, discussing about recognition of Indigenous peoples in the regions, livelihoods, collective rights, and climate change. So before I introduce our guest speakers, I have a few words to acknowledge the land we are on. So this land acknowledgement serves to remind everyone that McGill University is located on ancestral, traditional, and unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and other nations have long been recognized as the custodians of these lands and waters. Jokjoge, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. So, however, given the online context, those in attendance today may be dispersed all over Turtle Island or, of course, beyond. Wherever you are probably situated on unceded Indigenous lands. So wherever you're joining us from, let us all acknowledge and respect the Indigenous people's continued connections with their ancestral and unceded territories. ILADA and this event honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we now live. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. Mr. Bambanze is a former senator of Burundi and representative of the Batwa Indigenous peoples in the Senate of Burundi. He is currently director of the Unite for the Promotion of Batwa, an organization created by the Batwa for the Batwa. Mr. Bambanze was one of its founding members in 1999. He holds a degree in African languages and literatures from the University of Burundi. Ms. Ibrahim is an Indigenous Oumarou woman from Chad. She's an expert in Indigenous peoples' traditional ecological knowledge and climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. She served as a co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change in COP 20, 21, 22, and 23, which pushed for greater recognition of the role of Indigenous peoples in the fight against climate change. Hailing from an Oumarou pastoralist community in Chad, Ms. Ibrahim founded the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, and works to empower Indigenous peoples' voices and ensure their inclusion on international platforms. She leads a number of projects that aim to improve Indigenous peoples' access to basic services, while also promoting their unique contribution to the protection of the environment at the local and national level. Ms. Ibrahim gained recognition for her work, and in 2019, she became the laureate of the prestigious Pritzker Emerging Environmental Genius Award. I will now pass the proverbial mic back to Luisa.
Thank you so much, Clara, for acknowledging the territory for we are connecting and for recognizing the relevance of these dialogues as a means to advance in the respect of Indigenous people rights. Vital and Hindou, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. We are very pleased to have you all here to talk about the context of Indigenous peoples in Africa, to have a glance about the situation. And I'm gonna start with you. Like, I'm gonna ask some questions and perhaps you can complement each other. And I'm gonna welcome you. You wanna say some greetings to people connecting from different places? Hindou, you want to greet?
Yeah, sure. Misal mini on pat modon on Bali jam on Yali jam and Gondon fu. I'm just like saying good evening or good afternoon from where you are in my mother tongue, and I'm so glad to be with you here and with the blessing of all the different land that we are there. Today I'm calling you from my non-indigenous land because I'm calling from Paris, but of course I'm coming from Chad. I'm an indigenous woman from the Mbororo pastoralist communities who are living around all Chad. So nice meeting all of you.
Thank you, Hindou. Vita?
Oui, bon après-midi et bonjour. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak in French. I think it is where I feel more comfortable. And merci, je m'appelle Vital Bambanze, je suis du Burundi, membre de l'instance.
From Burundi, I'm a member.
Aussi, je suis parmi les membres fondateurs de l'organisation nationale pour la promotion des battoirs, qui a été fondée en 1999, contrairement à ce que Mme Krala a dit. Ce n'est pas 1989, mais plutôt 1999. Je suis aussi membre de certains réseaux autochtones de l'Afrique, notamment le Repaléac et l'IPAC. Aussi, nous sommes connectés à d'autres réseaux mondiaux des peuples autochtones, et c'est dans ce cadre même que je pense que Luisa a eu le plaisir de nous inviter ici pour parler surtout des défis et complexités sur le peuple autochtone en Afrique. Et nous sommes honorés d'avoir une large participation à ce dialogue, et aussi nous sommes contents que Hindou et moi sommes prêts à parler. Et je pense que je vais laisser beaucoup plus la parole à Hindou sur les questions de changement climatique. Et moi, je vais beaucoup plus me baser sur les questions des peuples autochtones.
Changes. I will speak on the topic. I don't know who is going to start.
Commencer pour donner beaucoup plus, miser beaucoup plus sur la complexité des questions autochtones en Afrique et les défis que nous rencontrons souvent. Hindou, vous le permettez?
I'm gonna start like with some questions, Vita, because I'm very interested in the region, and I would like to start with something because I'm from Latin America, and the situation, as you are aware, about recognition in Latin America is very different, and the context is different. So I would like to start like talking about the recognition of Indigenous peoples in many countries in Africa, and the legal recognition per se, and there is any country that have ratified ILO 169, a convention, for instance. We have the UN Declaration of Indigenous People Rights. So you both come from like different peoples. Hindou is pastoralist, and Vital is come from forest people. And I would like to start with you, Hindou, if you allow me. And how is the status in a nutshell of recognition of indigenous peoples in Africa? And how is the situation there? How states are advancing in recognizing indigenous peoples?
Uh, Thank you, Luisa. Of course, I start, and my brother Vital also can complete. So, firstly, people need to understand the difference between indigenous peoples in the term of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples and indigenous peoples as Black peoples coming from the African continent. So this is the complexity from the definition of the indigenous peoples of Africa. I remember it was 2006. It was in September when the first proposition of the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Right of Indigenous Peoples in New York started. And it was blocked. So blocked by Kenya, and of course, there was United States, but Tanzania, Kenya was the countries who blocked it because they say all of us are indigenous. And then they didn't adopt the declarations. And at that time, they went back to IFGIA, who is the Indigenous Working Group organization, to work with the African Union, especially the expert group on human and people rights, to come up with the report to define who are the indigenous in the term of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. And then there is the report that come out from the African Commission for the Human and People Rights with 5 criteria to differentiate who are the indigenous peoples as indigenous in the UN declarations, and who are the rest are, of course, the Black indigenous peoples coming from the African continent. So then the criteria come to say you have to be a communities who are self-identify yourself. So I cannot come say Vital is indigenous or Bibata is not indigenous. So it is Vital and his community who can identify themselves. And secondly, you have to get a connection with your land, with your territories, with your resources. And thirdly, you have to be the people who can speak the knowledge, the language that are related to your territories. And then the fourth is you have to be like discriminated than others, because otherwise all the African can say we are in the same box. And then you have to be marginalized and disconnected from what the others are doing. So then at the end, they come back to the communities. So we have, for example, in the North Africa, so all the group of the Berber that they are calling them, but in their name, they call themselves the Amazigh peoples. So between when you go to Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, etc. And when you come to the East Africa, so then you have all the Maasai or the Barana, etc. between the Kenya, Tanzania, and even you can go to Ethiopia, one part of it. And when you come to Central Africa, so you have the peoples that they call them Pygmy as the Vital communities, but they do not call themselves Pygmy. It is so insulting to call them like that. So they have Baka, Bagili, Bambuti, so they have their name of all peoples. And of course, you have in Central Africa the Mbororo peoples who are part of the bigger Fulani group, but we are part of the one who are in the bush. So we are living between Central Africa and West Africa. When you go to Austral Africa, you have the peoples that they call them the Bushmen, and Bushman is also insulting. So they are calling themselves Khoi, and you have the Khoisan. So when you take all these different group of the peoples, what we have in common is our life and livelihood is related to the nature, and we depend from the nature, and we protect this nature. From the Congo Basin to all the desert, when you go to West Africa, you get Tuareg peoples and the Mbororo. So then through the desert to the savannas to the mountain to all the tropical forests of the Central Africa, we are protecting the nature, and we are the people of nature. Coming to the recognitions, it is so hard for the African government still to recognize. But when we went back in 2007, 13th of September, that was the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. So all African countries adopted. and working going during the years. You get now the constitution of Kenya who recognize the indigenous peoples. When you go the recent one, just some weeks ago, the DRC Republic have a law on indigenous peoples that is adopted. But of course, you have Congo Brazzaville, and then you have like my country Chad, who have the right of pastoralists. And as my brother Vital can talk for himself, they have a quota on having indigenous peoples in the parliament, in the Senate, as he used to be the formal senators. So that how is the recognitions? We is still in this step. Deeply in our communities is recognized. Legally, regional level is recognized. Nationally, we need more law to get reinforced. But I will be happy also to hear from Vital perspective. Thank you, Luisa.
Thank you, Hindou. Vital, are you there?
Oui, je suis toujours en ligne. Merci à Hindou.
I'm here. Thank you very much, Hindou. You have provided a lot of information about the African context. And I would add that this is a very complex issue. It depends on the national context. It depends on the geographical distribution. We have talked about it. The geographical distribution of indigenous people, but also we are talking about actions that are done by pastoralists, by agriculture and others in Africa. There's also another complexity when we talk about languages. With the colonization, indigenous people have been divided in different countries. Those borders have divided indigenous people. In Africa, for example, in the Great Lake region, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Uganda, and DRC. I am sorry, this is interpreted, but the sound comes and goes. And in some places,
légal même des peuples autochtones. En RDC maintenant, on est obligé d'avoir une loi sur la protection spéciale des droits des peuples autochtones. Du moment qu'au Burundi, au niveau de la Constitution, nous avons la reconnaissance de la participation aux instances de prise de décision, notamment à l'Assemblée
of indigenous people in the Senate, in the National Assembly, in the East African Assembly. We also have now a minister for human rights. And we do understand that this has to do with evolution in politics. During the monarchy, indigenous people, well, they were living by themselves. But when the colonialism entered into Africa, then they said, okay, all Africans are considered indigenous people. After colonization, we can see that at an African charter level, for example, we talked about equality, self-determination. We talked about all rights for African people. But after the white people left, I think that the context changed, and
la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones, au niveau de l'Afrique, on pensait que l'autodétermination prendrait une sorte de sécession, c'est-à-dire de gestion des territoires d'une façon politique par les peuples autochtones. D'où les peuples dirigeants ou les autorités dirigeantes de l'Afrique qui, avant
the African authorities during the independence were in favor of the self-determination of people, and the indigenous people did not enjoy rights in order to be and to use land rights. Nowadays, the African Commission recognized indigenous people according to different criteria. And we have to mix indigenous people with minorities. That's what the Commission is saying. Those are practices that are seen today, because the recognition and rights nowadays have a positive aspect.
Revenons sur beaucoup plus la question qui est beaucoup plus posée, c'est la question de reconnaissance de droits fonciers et la reconnaissance des droits des peuples autochtones sur la gestion des ressources naturelles, parce qu'on a vu que le tout avec la façon dont les peuples autochtones ont vécu sur le terre et le territoire, la gestion des territoires,
the management of territories that implies the use of water is important. In some countries where multinationals are present, we see that indigenous people are victim of grabbing of their land, and sometimes they are displaced from their ancestral territories in order to adopt other more modern livelihoods. And this is a true problem, because we're talking about development, but what kind of development? Development in cities, development in the communities' territories, where, and the definition of development must be shaped thanks to consultations with indigenous people. And this is a complexity, because we have many projects nowadays, many development projects that are imposed to indigenous people without any negotiations. And when indigenous people, when I mean those projects are not successful, well, the fault is always attributed to indigenous people. And indigenous people have their own way of life. It's important to talk with them in order to have their opinion. We are Maasais, Berbers, Bororo, Khoisan, and we want to participate in the country's development. But we want also to manage our traditional way of life. And it's important to pass on the future generation those knowledge. I think we are going to talk about the climate crisis in some minutes, but it's important to talk also about the decision-making process at an international level. Indigenous people have the same rights as other indigenous people, as those of Latin America, of Asia, or Europe, or even North America. And my answer is no. During the discussion with indigenous people, the idea was to divide them and say the indigenous people of Africa are different because they are in Africa. So there is no globality. And this is due to colonialism. And another thing is indigenous people in Africa understand, it's important for them to understand the fight to their rights. It's this has to do with who is indigenous, who is more indigenous, and this particularity can be seen.
Lutter pour le peuple autochtone, pour leurs droits, on dit voilà, vous de l'Afrique du Nord, ce contexte vous plaise beaucoup et ceux de l'Afrique centrale, en tant que chasseurs-cueilleurs, vous devriez lutter comme ça. Mais on devrait comprendre que c'est une dynamique internationale et c'est la question de droit, lesquels droits nous sommes nés avec et lesquels droits devraient être jouis sans aucune autre considération de gauche à droite. Merci, je pense que je peux me limiter là et je pense que la discussion ou le dialogue va continuer. Merci.
Thank you so much, Vital. I think you addressed some of the questions I had about legal recognition and territorial rights. I want to go and switch the conversation about somehow climate change, Hindou. You have been leading this work at global, regional, and national level, and you and Vital drafted a paper, a document for the previous session for the UN Permanent for Indigenous Issues about the conflicts for use of natural resources. And in this paper, you both mentioned how Africa is being largely affected by climate change, specifically in indigenous peoples in the region. So I just wanted to talk to you about the intersectionality, about the lack of legal recognition, territorial rights, and the impacts of climate change on indigenous peoples. For instance, you people, the pastoralist people, maybe you can talk to us about it. Thank you, Hindou.
Sure. So, firstly, I am coming from a communities that are living across borders. And of course, before the colonization, it used to be only our land. So my own relative, my uncle, my aunties, I have a direct cousin who get a nationality from Central African Republic, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, and even Sudan. So that's mean before the colonization, it used to be our land where we are navigating around all these places are pastoralists. And of course, it is the same when you go to Batwa peoples. So they are also navigating across all the Congo Basin between Cameroon, Gabon, DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, even to all these areas. And it is the same when you go to the Maasai peoples between Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. So that's mean for us, we are the peoples who are depending from a bigger lands areas. So when the climate change come, it's not choosing the frontiers to get impact. It is impacting us directly because we are the most vulnerable. Our life and livelihood depend from this nature where we are living and depending from it. So the change, I give you some of the examples from where I come from. So I come around the Lake Chad. So Lake Chad used to be the number 4 bigger large fresh water in Africa. And it's 1996, it used to be 25,000 kilometers square of the fresh water. And when I get born, like 30 years ago, it was only 10,000 kilometers squares. And right now it's about 1,200. So 90% of the water just evaporated. So that means all the resources are shrinking because of the climate change impact.
Luisa, je pense qu'il n'y a pas. I think there is no interpretation now in French.
I don't know. The interpreter, she's coming back. Désolé. She's coming.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Do you want me to wait a minute?
Yes, please, because we have French speakers. So we want to ensure
Yeah,
that.
because I see there are many participants from French-speaking country, so it could be better to wait until the French interpretation is recovered so that all can participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. 1 minute, Hindou, please.
Okay. L'interprète est de retour?
No.
C'est quoi la majorité des participants? Si la majorité est en français, moi je passe en français.
Je pense qu'il y a un peu d'équilibre.
Un peu d'équilibre anglophone et francophone. Ok, so then let's
mais je peux dire qu'aujourd'hui, il y a eu une large participation des francophones, ce qui est différent des ateliers du passé.
She's back. I'm going.
Okay. So,
okay.
We can now proceed.
Wait.
Ok, très bien. Je sais même pas là où j'étais parce que là, ça perturbe un peu. So, I will try to catch. I don't know where I landed because it's a little bit confusing when you just start talking and you stop. So yeah, I was saying, I think how the climate change is impacting us. So I was giving the example of the Lake Chad, who used to be 25,000 kilometers squares, and now 90% of the water just evaporated. And the sad history around the place, you have more than 40 million people living around this lake. And they are all depending from these fragile ecosystems. And you have my peoples and these indigenous communities who are the nomadic pastoralists living around this lake. So that means our way of transhumance have to change because the pastures become very rare and the water become very rare. So we have to migrate from one place to another one. So that creates
Il faut migrer d'un côté
the farmers and the pastoralists. And that is a source of a big divisions of the communities because they are fighting each other to get access to the natural resources. And at the same time, it's create also a migration around the regions. And most of the men of the communities, they have also to go to the big cities to look for the new job. If they didn't have a job, they cannot come back. And then they leave the women and the children back home and fighting in their own. So climate change became a big threat for all the indigenous peoples around Africa, from the drought to the floods. So we are experiencing the extreme weather events, and as most of the Africa indigenous peoples are the one who are putting the food in the tables, so the food insecurity is become a big problem. So if we can take the examples just like of the rainy season this year, so we get a big flood around all Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and we get a big drought around all Kenya, Tanzania, etc. So at the end of the day, you have the same continents, and then these two areas who are all devastating from the flood to the drought. And then the peoples who got the cattle, so they are the most impacted because it's create a food insecurity, economy who can impact the poverty, and they cannot send their children to school, and it's become a big disaster. It is the same when we take the issue of the Congo Basin. It creates also the conflict between the communities because you have the communities who can migrate in around the forest, and then you have an illegal mining and illegal logging who can come around all the Congo Basin. And that also make the indigenous peoples more vulnerable because those who are coming are stealing their land. And on the top of it, you have all the conflict, the geopolitical conflict around all the regions who can become accentuated on the life of indigenous communities. So when you take the Car Republic, the Central African Republic. So there are the communities that are fighting. So we got a lot of refugees in Chad, and most of them are also coming from the Mbororo pastoralist communities who lost their cattle and now who have to live between Chad and Cameroon. And at the same time, those who are in Rwanda and then North Kivu, they is still like now, right now, with all what is happening in geopolitics there, the indigenous communities are the most impacted. They have to leave their own land. So climate change, environmental degradation, it's bringing more and more other crises like economic crisis and security crisis, and that is the reality of life of the indigenous peoples around all Africa. However, indigenous peoples is still in Africa the most people who are driving the solutions, because we are so far from all the decisions that are taken at the international level or the science from developed nations. So we use our indigenous people's traditional knowledge to get adapt and be resilient to the climate change. So when you come to our communities, our peoples are very advanced on a traditional medicine, because there is no school, but we use our plant, our herb to heal our peoples. We are also very advanced on the strategies of the resilience and adaptation, because peoples can know where is the water the year that it is drought, or where is the food the year that it is flooding. So those traditional knowledge are so important for the survival of our peoples. So how we do to keep them, like in my organization, we work in 2 projects. One of them is how we can collect the traditional knowledge. So we work with the communities around different areas, the wind knowledge, the water knowledge, the herb tree knowledge, the star knowledge. So we have the categorizations of the different knowledge based on a different kind of the ecosystem. I give you one examples. Like when we talk about the season, we build a calendars based on ecosystem for us. So the peoples who are living between the Sahara and savannas, we have 5 seasons. Those who are living between the savannas and tropical forests, we have 7 seasons. And all the seasons are based with information that coming from the tree, from the plant, from the wind, from the star, etc. So that help our communities to navigate, to keep them healthy, and then to also better manage the natural resources. The other project that we are working is how to combine the science knowledge and traditional knowledge together to build a participatory mapping in order to give the communities to take the decision to mitigate the conflict between each other. So under all that, like indigenous peoples of Africa are working also through some network. So as Vital said earlier, we have Repaliac that is based in our 11 countries working on the Congo Basin. We have IPAC that is based on 24 countries with 135 organizations. But of course, we have other organizations who are not firstly like a network, but who are also based in their own as an indigenous organizations that are in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Uganda, etc., who are working on their own. So we are under a different umbrellas, but working all to fight climate change, to protect biodiversity, and then to link it with our human rights.
Hindou, I have a question, because last year when the Special Rapporteur of Drinking Water and Sanitation, Pedro Arrojo, was preparing the reports on indigenous people, you were mentioning how international cooperation were increasing the conflicts among indigenous peoples and other peoples, for instance, to access to water. And since we are heading to the water conference next week, and also is one of the major issues not only in Africa but around the world. How you think the interventions of cooperation coming from outside, and what Vital was saying, the lack of free, prior, and informed consent when designing and implementing this project has been worsening the situation of indigenous peoples?
So firstly, people have to understand, like in Africa, most of our constitutions have like land, territories, resources belong to the government. And then in those constitutions, they put like some sentence to say like, oh, traditional management is accepted. So there is already controversy, but that gives the opportunity to the government to allow the other companies coming from the outside to steal the land of the communities. So when they come, they just like talking to the government, getting some permit, and having some piece of the land where they can do their own activities. Or you have a rich people who can become a minister or general or whatever, who also grab the land, and especially the land who are next to the rivers, next to the lake, where there is really water. And then they take this land, they just surround it with a big hall. So then people cannot get access, the cat cannot get access, and then they just like occupy the land. So these occupations have no free, prior, and informed consent. It have no consultation at all. And this is the big disaster that is happening. So we're experiencing like bigger companies that coming from the Europe, but also from China, from India, who are doing the agroecology, or who are just like doing some experiences that we do not understand, who are grabbing the land of the peoples. And when you go to the indigenous communities, you found the communities who do not have access just to the simple water to drink, just to the simple water. In 21st centuries, people do not have access to the clean water to drink. People is still drinking the water that the cattle can drink. The human being can drink this same water. So this land grabbing and the resource grabbing by the other companies is a big threat for all the indigenous peoples around Africa. Some are more impacted than others, but it's still a big issue because there is no proper legislation and proper consultation with the indigenous peoples around all the regions. Of course, we are going to the water conference. Hopefully that in the water conference, they will allow indigenous peoples to make a statement to talk about water is belong to everyone, and we are living around this water for centuries. We are protecting this water, and we deserve the right to protect it. So water cannot be privatized because some companies are coming to use that for the benefit. So it is not a commodity. It must be an access for the right for everyone, but not a commodity where they can build their own market to make a benefit and sell the places of the indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Vital. Last year at the COP15, where there were the discussions about recognizing indigenous peoples' territories as part of the conservation measures, and you were with Hindou discussing the experience that you had last year, that the government indigenous peoples allowing these things happen. So maybe you can share more with us.
Oui, j'ai entendu ce qu'elle a dit parce que je comprends bien l'anglais. Même si je parle le français, ce que je comprends bien quand Louisa parle.
What said Luisa, because we had a sound problem.
De terre et territoire, moi je cite d'abord le contexte dans une notion de
Talk
droit.
about the context, and when the indigenous people, we want our rights, we are talking about a respect and promotion of our rights. It's not additional rights what we are asking for. It's fundamental rights, rights that are recognized at a national, regional, and international level, that are in different international documents that have been ratified but have not been implemented. When we are talking about land, the land is not only a source of production for agriculture and other, but it's also to identify people. It's the land where someone grew up, where someone was born, and it represents the identity of each of us, the cultural, religious, and religious identity of us. Serac said that you are Burundi, Ethiopian, South African, European, etc. The notion of land for us is the recognition of our rights as citizens of our respective countries. For example, when we talk about environmental protection law, and when they were adopted for protection of protected zones, protected areas, this has been passed without our consent. This has to be reviewed because it's important to see what damages have been made, and we have to compensate those damages. It's important for indigenous people to participate in this kind of negotiations. Now, when we are talking about agriculture, we are talking about the monocultures. And this has led to different impacts, to deforestation, to climate changes. And this has negative impacts on indigenous people. And so compensation and participation of indigenous people are essentials and are not taken into account. We are talking about polluted countries. It's important to see or to define what is compensation for indigenous people when we're talking about their land, their territories that were grabbed. Because due to that, indigenous people have
en œuvre de recommandations qui découlent par exemple des différentes COP et autres conférences qui sont liées à différentes conventions de Rio de Janeiro. Là,
about other measures and the Rio de Janeiro Convention on climate change. We have made many pledges, and it's important for people that have been victims of the climate change, that those people can be compensated. The member states that are major participants, how can we develop those procedures in Africa? Those procedures became bilateral, and indigenous people are not taken into account. And it's important for them to benefit from the exploitation of natural resources and to use our traditional knowledge that tend to disappear. So it's important to understand how to protect the traditional knowledge of indigenous people that contribute to the environment protection and that contribute to fight against climate change, because fishing, agriculture, etc., those are activities that do not have an impact on climate change. And the future generations will benefit from the land given by the indigenous people and protected by the indigenous people. We are talking about Christians and other religions, but who started the world activity, and this has to do with an anthropic aspect. Those different activities have an impact on land and territories. Therefore, negotiations must take into account indigenous people. We are talking about desertification. What are the activities that led to that problem? Well, human activities. We're talking about pollution, industrialization, and carbon emissions. This is due to deforestation, but we have to leave our forests. So it's important to take that problem into account. And traditional knowledge is essential for the protection of a forest. This has been spoken during the Rio de Janeiro conference, for example. So we are participating in an international context, but when we come back to Africa, and when we want to benefit from this international framework, well, things are different. Next week, we all gonna be in New York. And what is the true participation of indigenous people? And okay, many of us have asked for a visa to go to New York, and how many actually got it? The indigenous people had the chance to participate as indigenous people, because we have to say that the technology in Africa is not the same as in other continents. We do not have the same resources, renewable energy, for example, or electricity. So how can indigenous people
que justement on puisse avancer ensemble? Sinon, ce sera continuer à marginaliser et à injecter beaucoup de fonds, mais au défi ou au détriment de la reconnaissance des droits des peuples autochtones. C'est dans ce sens-là que une communication d'une façon horizontale, c'est-à-dire entre les organisations des peuples autochtones, et je dirais même au niveau vertical entre les États et les peuples autochtones, pour savoir trouver des solutions durables afin que tous nous puissions jouir de tout ce qui est reconnu comme droit à tout être humain. Merci.
Thank you, Vital. And Vital, you talk about compensation, and Hindou, you have been leading this work on climate change. I would like to close these questions to open the floor to people who are posting questions in the chat. It's about direct funding, direct access funding for indigenous people, for biodiversity, conservation, climate change, and deforestation. And we have the pledge in COP26, and in COP27, you and other indigenous people presented the principles. So perhaps you can tell us more about it and how you envision that this can advance on the recognition of rights and the protection of knowledge of indigenous peoples.
Sure, Lisa. I think all that cannot work without giving direct access finance for indigenous peoples in order to protect our knowledge, in order to restore the ecosystem, and also to just like build our own way of development. So when we talk about the investment on indigenous peoples, of course, we can refer firstly to the COP26 when there was a first meeting. I remember it was 2 of November when all the head of state come together and say we have to invest on indigenous peoples, and then they committed 1.7 billion to the indigenous communities. So then at the end, the 1.7, they already spent 19% of it when we went to the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Only 7% of this money went to the indigenous peoples. So all the indigenous peoples was asking the questions, where is the rest of the money? The 93% went to the big NGOs, to the UN agencies, and to the government. And at the end of the day, are they investing on indigenous peoples? They are not giving us the money. So indigenous peoples come together just 1 year before. So then we discuss around what the meaning of the direct access funding is for us. And we develop 10 principles. Through the principles, we say when you want to fight climate change, protect the environment, you cannot choose the ecosystem that you like. You must protect all the ecosystem together. And that's how we have to invest on the indigenous peoples through all the 7 sociocultural regions where peoples are living in the glaciers or in the desert or in the savannas or in the tropical forests all together, because we have to protect all the ecosystem together. And then we come by saying there are so many intermediaries. When there is funding, there are a lot of intermediary before that is get access to the indigenous organization and get access to the indigenous communities who are back home. So at the end of the day, most of the money is just like losing in the bureaucracy. So direct access funding is also meaning that the money go to the indigenous organizations. And then we say there is maybe some criteria. Organization can say you don't have the capacity to do the Excel report or whatever. We say the system is not working. So it is the time that they trust our own system and then work in the criteria that's set up by the indigenous peoples in order to give the direct access funding. So we work through all those criteria. We launch it in the COP27 and also in the COP15 in Montreal. So how we can give this direct access funding to the indigenous peoples if the philanthropic or the government or the other NGOs wanted to work with the indigenous peoples, the way that they can do that. So however, the funding that we want for the indigenous peoples is also through the access and benefit sharing. And we do have that in the Nagoya protocols, where when you work with the indigenous peoples, you have the indigenous knowledge, how you can create a mechanism of the access and benefit sharing. So you can share the benefit with the communities, and you can have also the ownership if it is the research for the indigenous people. So then the communities can benefit from what they provide to the world. So we need this direct access funding. And this is very urgent because we are talking about the climate change, and climate change is impacting everyone. And we do have the solutions because we are not the victim, we are also the solutions. And then our solution need the money. So one of the things is to do not call us beneficiaries, because we are partners. We have something to put in the tables. So as partners, we need this funding, and we provide our knowledge in order to fight all against climate change.
Okay, thank you so much, Hindou, and thank you so much, Vital. I'm gonna stop here from posing questions, but I seen that some people have posted some questions in the chat, and people can take the floor if they want. I want to ask, with this question that Edith has constantly put in the discussion in the chat, is about the protection of indigenous African children and the increase of risks of being victims of violence. I don't know, Hindou, Vital, who wants to take the floor to reply to this question.
Sure. So the indigenous children are really on the risk because the communities are living under poverty. So there is 2 risks that I'm seeing from my side. When the COVID started, So you got the communities who getting married their girls in a very early age to the peoples who got more money. And this is really unfortunate because they just like, and in certain kind, they have to opt for their own needs. So then in another way, they are selling their children in order to get some access to the food. So that is the way of threatening the indigenous children who do not have the power to get their voice here. On the other hand, you have the indigenous children who can be forced to join the army. And this is unfortunately what is happening also around DRC, where you can see like the children that joining the soldiers because they are kidnapped or because the community do not have access. So how to protect it? We have the special rapporteurs for the right of indigenous peoples who can help also by highlighting or visiting the countries to say the right of the children as indigenous kids. And we do have also the expert mechanism who can do the study if the country is requesting the study in order also to protect the indigenous children. But however, it is also the indigenous communities who can protect the children from all the threats that is happening.
Thank you, Hilda. Vital, do you want to say something about this question?
Oui, merci. Ça, c'est une question vraiment très importante pour nous quand on parle des enfants. On peut dire que les enfants rient, les enfants pleurent dans les langues maternelles, c'est-à-dire que les enfants vivent la vie que leur communauté vit du jour au jour. Si nous sommes ici en train de parler pour défendre les droits des peuples autochtones, c'est-à-dire que nous voulons que cela se fasse pour que les générations futures ne puissent pas vivre les conditions dans lesquelles nous avons vécu, notamment les questions de marginalisation, les questions de discrimination, les questions d'exclusion à l'école et même dans les communautés. Ce qui se fait maintenant, et nous le regrettons beaucoup plus, ce sont les enfants qui sont victimes des violences qui s'observent sur le continent africain maintenant. À l'heure où nous parlons, nous savons que, par exemple, en RDC, il y a des conflits armés qui se font dans l'est de la République démocratique du Congo. Ces enfants, des peuples autochtones, même des enfants de non-autochtones, sont victimes de cette violence des personnes que nous dirons sont adultes, mais qui ne se battent que pour des intérêts, je dirais, économiques et politiques. Et là, ce qu'il faut, c'est la démilitarisation des zones des peuples autochtones pour que pendant les crises ou les conflits armés, il faut une protection spéciale des peuples autochtones. Ici, à côté, en Tanzanie, le cas de l'Oliondo, on a vu des armes automatiques crépiter sur des peuples sans armes.
Automatic weapons that have fired against the people that had no arms. And when we are talking about the problem, the answer is a pacific solution has been given to that problem. But the truth is, we have heard gunshots and we haven't seen children coming back from those areas. So we have heard Pierre Member when he was combating in DRC. For example, when you eat flesh of an indigenous person, you are protected against fire shots. Or for example, that's an example. There's other examples. All those examples lead to an issue.
N'autorise pas la jouissance des droits des peuples. L'impact, c'est sur nos enfants. Et les enfants marginalisés ne peuvent pas aller à l'école facilement. Quand on dit on ne peut pas s'asseoir avec un enfant autochtone à l'école, les conséquences, c'est qu'il ne devra pas devenir un cadre du pays dans le futur. D'où tout ce qu'on fait maintenant. Si nous avons été victimes du passé négatif, il faut promouvoir d'une façon spécifique la protection des droits de l'enfant et surtout les protéger dans des cas de conflits armés. C'est là le rôle qui serait joué par le HCR, les agences de protection des enfants, l'UNICEF, les UNESCO pour la protection et la promotion de la culture des peuples autochtones. Parce qu'en perdant nos langues, parce que ça c'est encore une autre chose, quand nos enfants ne comprennent plus nos langues, quand nos enfants ne comprennent plus nos cultures, est-ce qu'ils vont comprendre qui sont-ils ou bien ils vont devenir des artificiels? Donc, il faut qu'on essaie d'introduire un développement qui ne nous amène pas à quitter nos cultures.
Developed a way of living that will.
Thank you, Vital. There is another question from Professor René Coupe. I hope you are pronouncing well your name. He said that this Central African Republic is the only one that has ratified ILO 169, and he wants to know if this ratification has had any relevance and effects on the promotion and recognition of the rights on the Twa and Pooh people living in this state. I don't know if Hindou Vital wants to reply that.
Bon, la convention 169 a été maintenant
That convention has been ratified by only one country, the Central African Republic. And we thank that country to have ratified this convention and have ratified the promotion and protection of traditional livelihoods of indigenous people regarding forests. And why the other countries have not ratified? And I'm talking about African countries. Well, first, we haven't understood the tools. The most ratified convention is the Children's Rights Convention. And now the question is, indigenous children's rights, are they respected? Indigenous children, are they enjoying rights? Their rights? I'm not sure. Regarding the 69 Convention, well, as I said, only one country ratified it. And can we say that this is a good example? And can we say that the convention has been implemented? Because sometimes some countries ratify conventions, but they do not implement those conventions or create mechanisms in order to implement the conventions. So we need concrete actions, and this in favor of communities. Actually, I was preparing a document on a paper on the participation of indigenous people regarding the conciliation in Burundi and Central Africa. But in those areas, the conflict we can see that there's a lot of person killed because of those conflicts. So this has an impact on the fact to fully enjoy rights. Sometimes countries can ratify conventions and start projects with donors. But when we are talking about implementing those projects, well, sometimes or many times, indigenous peoples are not taken into account. When the World Bank is launching a new project, all countries have to say that projects are going to count on indigenous people. But is that really true? Do indigenous people benefit from a direct financing? It's important to have a mechanism for a follow-up and to measure projects. Are those projects giving benefits to indigenous people? Are they implemented? Because sometimes indigenous people are not.
I want to add one thing. So if the Batwa peoples benefit from the ILO 169 in Czech Republic, I can say that the High Commissions on Human Rights, the UN High Commission on Human Rights, started a process with the Czech Republic in order to work with the government and especially to work with the parliamentarian in order to set up a mechanism to implement the ILO 169. So when they start this war, the crisis in the Czech Republic started. So then it's just like it stopped at that time. So of course, like there is something that is moving, but it has to be more quicker than that. Over.
Thank you, Hindou. I have two people that raised their hands. Yeah, Ibrahim, Kelly, you want to open the mic and you can pose your questions?
Yeah, Luisa, thank you so much for giving me the floor. And also wish to thank Hindou. I also see the name Ibrahim. I'm also called Ibrahim Adamo. I'm from Cameroon. I'm a program associate for livelihood and resilience with the World Food Program based in the east region of Cameroon. It was a great pleasure for me hearing Hindou talking about the experience in Chad, given that I also worked in the far north region, which is a border region with the Republic of Chad, where I also had so much experience working with the indigenous people, mostly the Mbororo people, and also with the Mbororo people in the far northwest region of Cameroon, where in Cameroon we have the Mbororo association called the Mboskuda. Yeah, I will just have some few contributions to give and a question. The first contribution is at the level of the rigs, where Hindou mentioned some of the rigs. I also wanted to add another rig in the situation of Cameroon, where we have that's indigenous exodus, where most of the indigenous people move from their community. Most of them get into the urban areas where they are involved in crimes due to the standard of living that is very hard for them. And all this indigenous exodus is due to what Hindou mentioned, like the claiming of their land and also like soil degradation, which is a climate impact. And also wish to ask a question. Like in the case of Cameroon with the WSA, we have the three-pronged approach, that is the integrated context analysis. Then we have the seasonal livelihood programming, and then also have the community-based participatory planning. So I just wanted to know, Hindou, with the case of Chad, I don't know if all these strategies are being used, like to identify and also to come up with some of the shock, like some of the climatic shock that most of these indigenous people overcome, and also with some of the strategy that is being used by some of these indigenous people, especially when conducting the community-based participatory planning, where some of these strategies can be, let me say, proposed to overcome some of the climatic shock. And then also, I just wanted to find out about the roles of indigenous women in the implementation or like in fighting some of these climatic conditions, climatic shock, because I know most often in the indigenous environment, the women have a great role to play, most especially like you have the indigenous people that are involved in transhumance, and which is like a consequence of a climatic shock. Some of these indigenous people that are involved in transhumance, the women have a great role to play. I also wish to know if some of their roles are also taken into consideration. For I do believe they have a great role to play. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Hindou?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ibrahim. And of course, we do have the same name. So yeah, that's one of the things in common we have. Yeah, I do know Bospuda. We work also with Bospuda, even Italian myself. So just like to come to your first questions about the planning and strategy. So in Chad, we do have a committee, interministerial committee on climate change, where involved like different representatives from the different ministries, including the Ministry of the Livestock, where the indigenous peoples are attached to. But we do have also some NGOs and our organization based on it. However, like committee is not too active on it, but what we do, we work with the government around the planning of the National Adaptation Plan. And now we have the National Adaptation Plan that are deposited to the UNFCCC 4 months ago. So then in these documents, we do have a paragraph in this National Adaptation Plan updated on indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' knowledge and experience. And they mention also like our organization, what we are doing there to just like deposit that at the UNFCCC in order to have a project and plan. So that is one of the way we are collaborating with the Ministry of the Environment and the Division on the Climate Change and Biodiversity in order to have integration of the indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' knowledge. And we also did organize a bi-regional gathering, Africa and Asia, where we have like a high level from the presidency to the ministerial level that was involved. And we had this meeting with the UNFCCC and many other indigenous communities. And that also helped us to emphasize how the role of the indigenous peoples are important in all the decisions that government are taking. Coming to your second questions, this is very crucial and very important. Women play a big role in the climate solutions, and if we just like giving them quota or checking the box, so that is not going to have the full solutions of all what we are doing. So what we do in my organizations, I give you one of the example on the 3D participatory mapping. So as we are coming from a man-led society, so it's not easy that to just like come and grab the area. But what we do is during the exercise, we just like allow the man to understand the role of the woman. So I remember one of the exercise, we try to identify a name of a protected sacred forest. And then the man was arguing within like 2 hours around the name and the utility of the places. They didn't agree. They even called someone in the phone. So we just to come back, we say like, okay, listen, let us give a floor to a woman. And one woman started explaining the things and everyone shut up, all silence. So at the end of the day, so we just to say, are you agree with what she said? They are all like, she know more than everyone, we agree. So that make them understand to change the strategy, and we change the methodology. We say now man can talk, but let women also talk because they are the one who have all the knowledge. And then everyone accepts, so women have the role to play on the climate change, definitely. We need to set up that in a different way in all the African regions, and especially in the indigenous culture, because it is always a man-led culture. We can do 100% women projects, but in the general project, how we can have also women roles and women decision making to be present on it. And thank you again, Ibrahim.
Thank you, Hindou. We're gonna go with the last question. Luther, you want to open your mic and pose the question? Thank you so much.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Luisa. This has been a very great interaction. I just wanted to, so mine is more of a conceptual question. I mean, I found everything about discussion in relation to climate change very insightful. Some of them I've lived them directly, both in terms of climate impacts themselves and the secondary impacts like the conflicts that arise from climate migration between, pastoralists and farmers in certain parts of Nigeria. And so, but I'm just wondering how we frame or put this within indigenous discourse. And my question honestly arises from insufficient knowledge about the concepts or discussions around indigenous people in general. I've understood it in several different ways. Sitting here in Canada, for instance, we know that we have discussed indigenous people. It's in relation to, colonial history, settler colony here. So in the context of family, in certain parts of Nigeria, indigenous, we're talking about it.
Sorry, Luther, I cannot hear you well. I don't know if it's just me.
Sorry.
No, we are losing your.
Completely?
It's very low.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Sounds like your headset is dying.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay, maybe I can give it to Vivata, and then you go back. We have 4 or 5 minutes because the interpreters leave it, so we need to close up.
Yeah,
thank you. Vivata, you want to open your mic?
Allô? Allô? Bonjour, vous m'entendez? Oui, je m'appelle Bibata Bari, je suis de la communauté pastorale.
From the pastoral community Curl from Burkina Faso. And I wanted to talk a bit about my situation. We're at war, and I'm living between Mali and Burkina Faso. We were nomads at first.
À l'époque, il y avait la terre, il y avait l'espace, donc nous bougions. Et maintenant, au fur et à mesure, avec la raréfaction des ressources et la bagarre autour des ressources et toute la compétition, nous nous sommes progressivement installés. C'est-à-dire, nous sommes passés du nomadisme au semi-nomadisme. C'est-à-dire, nous bougeons. Pendant la saison des pluies, nous bougeons. Moi, je parle de ma zone d'où nous sommes. Les peuples pastoraux sont les premiers à s'installer là-bas. À l'époque, quand mes grands-parents, mes arrière-grands-parents s'installaient, il n'y avait personne. Les autochtones, c'était des lions et des animaux sauvages, donc il n'y avait personne. Ils se sont installés et maintenant, il y a eu la concurrence parce que les terres se sont raréfiées, les ressources.
There are more people because there's a lack of resources. There were a lot of competition. So they said to the others to come to their land, to good land that were fertilized thanks to the cows.
Installer les autres. Progressivement, l'école est venue, l'école moderne est venue et nos populations se sont retrouvées mises en marche parce que nous bougions. On bouge pendant la saison des pluies, quand même qui dure 4-5 mois. On bouge pour aller un peu loin, pour laisser ceux qui cultivent cultiver. Et l'école est venue, ceux-là sont allés à l'école, nous ne sommes pas allés à l'école. Et progressivement, ils sont devenus les propriétaires de la terre. Enfin, du coup, chez moi, l'État appartient, la terre appartient à l'État. Donc, ils n'ont pas la propriété, ils n'ont pas le droit de propriété à la terre. Donc, ils sont restés marginaux. Et ils ont continué comme ça. revenir encore nomades. C'est-à-dire, ils ont essayé de se sédentariser, mais comme il y a eu la pression sur la terre et que les autres sont venus s'installer, ils se sont retrouvés encore à se déplacer d'un point A, un point B, un point C. Ils sont restés dans cette situation-là et à marge. Et maintenant, avec la guerre,
what we see right now is that this area is not a secured area. A nomad with their animals cannot move to urban areas, so they have to stay there. To stay, they do not benefit from the state protection. They survive, yes, but I just wanted to say that our way of living, if we can live with our livelihoods, we can live from our territories. Women are in charge of food, medicine, take care of children, because most of men left because of the war. And so women cannot leave their territories. They do not know how to write or read. We have to stay where we are. Those areas are under.
Mais on espère que la paix va revenir plus tard. Il ne faudrait pas nous oublier. Moi, je sais que la sœur Hindou est là. Bon, en Afrique centrale, et ça va. Ils ont quand même voilà, la protection de l'État. Mais chez nous, il n'y a pas de contrôle pour l'instant. Je sais que les autres se battent parce que moi, je considère mes populations comme des autochtones. Ils sont là-bas. La preuve, quand tout le monde est parti, ce sont eux, les peuples pasteurs, qui ne peuvent pas partir. Ils restent là-bas au risque de leur vie. Donc, il faudra penser à trouver des moyens aussi de ne pas les oublier, quoi, de les protéger. Donc, voilà un peu mon plaidoyer et mon petit témoignage.
Merci beaucoup, Vivata. Vital or Hindou, you want some insights from the...
Yeah. So firstly, I wanted to
Oui,
respond to
moi je
Luther.
voudrais d'abord, avant de revenir.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, go
okay,
ahead.
So I say firstly, I wanted to respond to Luther, his first questions, even we couldn't hear his second questions. So Luther's, as you said, there is need of making understand many people's the situations of the African indigenous peoples. So it is unfortunate because we still do not have a lot of data. So we still do not have a lot of statistics who can show that the indigenous peoples of Africa and what is we are doing, etc. So that need to be shown to all the world, and especially having maybe some study and having some kind of seminar. I really appreciate now what Luisa and her colleague are doing to give the chance to talk about the African indigenous peoples, but we need to duplicate this one even around Africa and then outside so people can understand the indigenous peoples and the indigenous people situation around the world in order to protect us and to promote our rights. Alors, je reviens après des batailles. So, des batailles, bien sûr, c'est un grand problème, l'insécurité, surtout l'insécurité autour du Burkina Faso et les communautés. Et c'est ça où on a aussi besoin de plus d'informations, plus de statistiques, mais plus de voix aussi des communautés qui sont les plus impactées, afin qu'eux-mêmes, ils parlent pour eux et puis ils défendent leurs droits. Parce qu'une fois que c'est les autres qui vont parler pour toi, ils vont détourner tout ce que tu es en train de dire. Mais si c'est toi qui vas parler pour toi-même, ça veut dire que tu auras plus de chances de t'expliquer et d'expliquer la situation. Et on comprend aussi, si jamais quelqu'un de la communauté essaye de parler, il doit être harcelé. Mais on est toujours sur l'harcèlement. C'est là où le rôle du rapporteur est spécial sur les droits des peuples autochtones peut être très important pour protéger les personnes qui parlent, mais aussi pour promouvoir les histoires des peuples autochtones par eux-mêmes. Over to you, Luisa.
Merci beaucoup, Hindou. Vital, your final remarks?
Oui, merci. Merci beaucoup. Luther a soulevé une question très essentielle et très frappante au cœur. Je voudrais dire que, sans même passer sur les questions des peuples autochtones, les défenseurs des droits de l'homme ont un problème très sérieux d'abord avec
defendants are facing a lot of problems. When we are talking about indigenous people's rights, we are considered as a problem because the people that have been slaves that led their land being grabbed that had led the others to take their land and to develop the country. It's important to say that indigenous people have to be protected, have to enjoy their rights. This is fundamental. It's important to take that into account. We need a special protection for people defending indigenous people's rights. And sometimes we are victims of our own communities. We talked about media, we talked about financing, etc. And sometimes we say, okay, those that are defending the indigenous people's rights are going to gain money. And it's important to create, they are trying to create a division amongst communities and not say to the state and to Mr. President, governor, or anyone else. It's important to tell them that they have to respect our rights. It's important to respect and promote our rights. We want to be taken into account as citizens. The indigenous kid that has not been to school because of marginalization has the right to be president, to be governor, to be a bank director, and anything else. And sometimes when we see an indigenous people in a business class, we say, why is he or she traveling in business class? Because he's an indigenous people. When you are going to buy a car, they are also saying that why an indigenous person is buying a car, and they are seeing us as inferior. We have the right to being experts, to being engineers, to being everything we want, and to contribute to the development of our nation. Mrs. Bieta, I won't say anything else, but Ibrahim said, when you're not going to defend your rights, no one is going to do it for you. And to conclude, because we are survivors of marginalization and exclusion, and if we had the chance to talk out loud, to contribute to our development of indigenous people, it's it's our duty to do it. It's our duty to talk out loud. And we need to develop our skills, our capacity to manage our own things and to contribute to the promotion and protection of other rights that
sans violer les droits des autres, et nous le faisons d'une façon pacifique en protégeant l'environnement, les ressources naturelles pour le survie de demain. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Vital. Merci beaucoup, Hindou. I want to appreciate not only for being part of these initiatives, but also for the incredible and tireless work that you do to advance in the recognition and protection of Indigenous people rights. I really appreciate your time. I know you are very busy. And thank you so much to all the people who connected from different parts of the world. And we were happy to have you all here, and we hope we can still connect in future dialogues. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Désolé, je ne parle pas français, but I was glad that we had interpretation, and so how it helped to reach out to more people. Thank you so much, and I hope you have good afternoon, morning, or rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Luisa, Vital, and thanks all participants. It was very nice talking to all of you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Merci. Au revoir.
Merci.